Yeah. Good morning. Happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day. It's good to be with y'all again as we continue our study into Revelation. If you got your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn to Revelation chapter 6, and we're going to pick up where we left off last month. Just a very quick refresher. I don't want to spend a lot of time refreshing here, but just to catch everybody up. The first thing that we looked at in our last study before we began chapter 6 was over the Olivet Discourse, that famous sermon or lesson that Jesus gives his disciples in Matthew 24, in Mark 13, and in Luke 21. Now, I want you to notice something really interesting about that. Notice I did not mention the gospel account of John. The gospel account of John is the only one out of the four that does not record the Olivet Discourse. And there is a debate among scholars that Revelation is the Olivet Discourse of John. And we have been looking into this very closely, and I believe that Daniel 12, the gospel accounts of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Revelation are all connected. And we're going to see that more and more as we study the book. Now, the last time I was with you and we were talking about the Olivet Discourse, I asked you the question, what would happen to Israel whenever they would rebel against God? Whenever they would basically commit adultery with other deities, pagan deities? What was often the result? They were conquered. They were conquered, they were oppressed, they were attacked. A lot of times they were taken into captivity, into slavery. Can anyone give me some nations that were used by God to deliver this type of judgment? Babylon, Midianites, Moabites, Ammonites, a lot of ites. Um, yeah. Pretty much everybody in that region at one point or another had their hand in oppressing Israel. Philistines. Yep. And what you would notice, Assyrians, and what you would notice is that when this would happen, God would use a nation to judge Israel. And then often he would turn the tables on that nation once judgment was delivered, and then he would judge that nation. You see that with the Babylonians, you see that with the Assyrians, the Midianites. You see the tables get flipped every time. Book of Judges. Yes. And that's where you see a lot of oppressive nations used by God to deliver judgment. And the Olivet Discourse is about a judgment that is coming specifically on Jerusalem, but will encompass the whole area of Judea and Samaria and Galilee. Basically, all of Israel will be judged in the upcoming next 30 to 40 years after Christ is resurrected. We read this parable, Mark 12, about the tenants. That famous parable where a vineyard owner has this landowner has a vineyard. He leases it out to tenants. By contract, those tenants would have been by contract. Their job was to take care of the vineyard, collect the harvest, and give a share to the landowner and to keep it upkept. That was their job. And in the parable, we see that when it came time for the harvest to be collected, that no matter how many servants the landowner sent, they would be abused, they would be killed. And then when basically he runs out of servants, he says, well, I'm just going to send my son. They're going to respect my son. I mean, I kind of look at that and I go, he's gave them responsibility. He's gave them task. Obviously, they are being compensated for their work. And so the landowner's logical thought is, if I send my son, he's my flesh, he's my blood, they'll respect him. They'll give him what's my share. But as the parable goes on, we read that that's not what happens. Instead, the tenants are greedy, and they're selfish, and they're murderous in their hearts. And they say, this is the heir, come let's kill him in verse 7, and the inheritance will be ours. And so they took the son, they killed him, and they threw him out of the vineyard. The word there is tossed out. So it's just a disgraceful act of, that's something they would do to criminals, just toss their bodies out for the birds to feed on. And so he asked the question to his disciples. He said, what's going to happen to the tenants? What's the vineyard going to do to them? And without them answering, he answers for them. And he says that he is going to kill them. And he's going to give the vineyard out to those who are going to actually take care of it. Talking about the religious elite among the Jews. Verse 12, we read that. Then the chief priests, teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him because they knew that he had spoken the parable against them. They knew that they were the bad guys. They knew they were the tenants. No other reason for them to be so angry with Jesus here, because Jesus painted them out to be the bad guys. We looked at Luke 19, which is sort of a part of that Olivet Discourse. If you read those verses there, he describes a perfect military siege that is going to take place against Jerusalem. Jerusalem would not be the only city in the Israel, Judea, Samaria area to be sieged. Other cities and villages were sieged. Yotapata was one. Masada was one. Jerusalem was the big one. Jesus makes it perfectly clear that they will be surrounded and that not one stone will be left upon another. All this plays out in the siege and the following destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Matthew 24:34, we went over this really quick. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. If you look at the Greek word for this is hutos. It describes a person or concept within reach, not something 2,000 years into the future. The word for generation in the Greek is gene, describes a multitude of people living within that certain period of time. So if you put those two Greek words together, he is talking about his audience. Anyone that is present listening may be alive when this event takes place 30 to 40 years later. 35 to 40 years later. I added this to the slide, kind of made some additions to this. So Jerusalem, when it all came down to Jerusalem, because you had all these cities being conquered from the south and from the north. General Titus was leading his legions up from Alexandria and Egypt. He's moving up northward and he's conquering the Judean region. And then from the north, you have the other generals that are coming down. There's 3 other generals. They're coming down from the north. And they're conquering all these strongholds of the Jews. 3 factions will arise in Jerusalem. Because what happens is, whenever the Romans would take a city, you would have people that would try to escape. And some of them would succeed. John of Gischala was one of these men. And it was real interesting how he did this. He was from the city of Gischala. That's why they call him John of Gischala. And he actually made a deal with Titus. He rode out on horseback to meet Titus in the battlefield. And he said, okay, listen, tomorrow's the Sabbath. Let us make preparations, enjoy our Sabbath, and then we can go to war. Well, Titus respected that. He said, okay, I'll agree to it. So as Titus goes back to camp, John of Gischala is making secret plans to escape. And he does so with a bunch of zealots. They leave the innocents in the town. So what do you think happens to the innocents that they leave behind? They're slaughtered. And they're taken into captivity. So John of Gischala was not a very good man to begin with. And his rise to power only will grow once he gets into Jerusalem. But he basically comes down I'll show you in a minute. He comes down south, down to Jerusalem, and then he finds his way into the city there. And of course, the Jews welcome him in his zealots because it just adds to their numbers. The other man was Simon Bar Giora. Simon Bar Giora would make his way to the city of Jerusalem. He was actually responsible for defeating Cestius Gallus in 66 AD. This was actually what sparked the war to begin with. What had happened was Rome wanted to collect taxes, and Jerusalem was not paying up. And so the Roman governor made a threat that he was going to come back and he was going to collect the money. Well, the people never delivered. So you know what they did? They went into the Jerusalem temple and they raided the treasury. And what do you think that done to the Jews? And they got mad, they revolted. That's what led to that revolt. The battle at Beth Horon, this was like a pass. It was like a pass in the wilderness, a mountainous region. And so the zealots were able to take the high ground, surprise the Roman army, and slaughter them all. I believe it was around, I think it was about 5,000 men. Just destroyed them. It was known to be one of the most humiliating defeats of the Roman army. And especially to the Jews, that was a disgrace to the Romans because the Romans did not like the Jews to begin with. They felt that they were, well, the title they had given them was they were porcupines. They were hard to control. They were hard to suppress, and just everything got them in an uproar. So why they went into the treasury and took that into the temple, that was a bad idea. And the other man was Eleazar. Not a lot is known about Eleazar besides that he was a big fanatic. He actually supported the high priest who declared himself to be king as the Roman army was making their way to Jerusalem to squash the revolt. But eventually he would actually be deceived by John of Gischala and would be executed. And then John of Gischala would take the temple. So you had three factions fighting within Jerusalem right before and basically right as Titus laid siege to Jerusalem. We went over this really quick. The Roman war with the Jews lasted close to 3.5 years. That's time and a half. You might notice that phrase in the scriptures. The siege lasted about 5 months. That number will also pop up in Revelation later. I told you the Civil War broke out. The bad thing about the Civil War is no one was safe. Even the innocents of the city were in danger all the time. Because when the factions would war with each other inside and outside the city walls, who were the ones to fall victim to that? The innocents. And so a lot of the food storages were burned up before Titus ever got there and laid siege. It's argued that they had so much food in Jerusalem that if they had not done this and they had banded together at the beginning of everything, they could have repelled the Roman invasion. Whether that's true or not, that's argued, but many Jews are killed in the war once it's all said and done. After the last sacrificial lamb was offered on August 5th of 70 AD, it was 25 days later when the Temple Mount would be ransacked and destroyed. This is a good map that kind of shows you the military movements of the Roman legions. You can see that as they made their way north and south, they conquered everything and every stronghold they could, sending people off to slavery and slaughtering all the men of fighting age. This is a good map of the map of Jerusalem. You see the upper city. I'll get this out here. Got this up here. So you've got the upper city here. This is the lower city. As you can see the difference in the house sizes there. This is the city of David. Here's your Mount of Olives. This is the Valley of Hinnom, also known as the Greek as Gehenna or Hell. That's another topic there. And then this right here is the north wall. This is actually the wall that Titus will break into, because Jerusalem sat basically on 7 hills or mountains just like Rome did. That's interesting, isn't it? And here's the Antonia Fortress. That's one of the first strongholds to fall to Titus. And then here's your temple. And that's the temple complex right here. So Herod built that temple when he took power in the region to please the Jews. It was one of his ways of, he was an Edomite, so the Jews didn't really like him to begin with. So he thought, well, I'll appease them one way or another. I'll build them a big old temple. And that's what he did. And it did make the Jews very happy, obviously. But the Antonia fortress was also built by Herod for the temple's defense. That's what it was built for. So when we talk about these factions going to war with each other, here's what happens. Eleazar ends up barricading himself inside the temple, the inner temple itself. Okay? Now he's deceived by John of Gischala, and he comes out and he gets killed. That's another lesson there. John of Gischala takes over the temple complex. The temple's not small. When I say the temple complex, it was big enough to house these two factions going to war with each other. So don't think that it was a tight little room where they would be bumping into each other's shoulders. It wasn't like that. It was huge. Yeah, about 25 acres, probably larger. From what I saw, you could fit thousands in this area. It's huge. And then Simon Bar Giora, when he got to Jerusalem, he brought in a bunch of Edomites or Idumeans who lived south of the region of Jerusalem, and they took control of the other parts of the city. So that's how you have your three factions going to war, major civil war in Jerusalem. This is an example, this is an artist rendition. When the Romans won wars, they did it methodically. They did it with siege works. They did it with precise calculations. They didn't just rush in. They tried not to. That space right there where you see the troops going into the temple complex, that's where the Antonia fortress was. Now, if you notice that, you're like, well, that looks like it's a paved road. That's what they did. When they destroyed the Antonia fortress and they had repelled the forces more inward into the complex, they had actually leveled the ground. And it was a way of doing that so they could bring their siege equipment in. Because when the Romans would siege a city, from what I read and studied, every tree within 10 miles of Jerusalem was stripped, was uprooted, cut down, stripped from the landscape. All the grass was burned up. It was called scorched earth. Anybody heard that phrase, scorched earth? And they would literally destroy everything to where if you were to come upon that city later on, you would say, no one ever lived here. That was the point. They would cut down trees and uproot trees, and they would make ladders. They would make battering rams. They would make ballistas. They would make catapults. They would take the boulders and the stone and the mountains, and they would hew them out into these interestingly oval-shaped rocks, boulders that they would launch into the city. What's interesting is they would actually paint these rocks with like a white limestone. And if you're thinking about later in Revelation, it talks about hail. There might be a connection there. We'll study that as we go on. But anyway, I just thought I'd go to that. Now, as we continued our study, we went into decreation language. In the Olivet Discourse, you read the same theme: war, strife, famine, disease, persecutions, earthquakes, decreation language. Decreation language was nothing new to the audience. It was nothing new to a Jew. Cosmic anomalies and Earth's destruction was a common writing method to explain a nation or empire or kingdom's downfall and the powerlessness of its leaders. The sun being blotted out, the moon turning to blood, stars falling from the sky, earthquakes, the sky being rolled up. We have always associated that language with what event? The end of the world. But this is not how they would have read this. Because if they had read it that way, then what about Isaiah 13, verses 10 through 13? Where he says, the stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, wicked for its sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and will humble the pride of the ruthless. He says right there, verse 13, I will make the heavens tremble and the earth shake from its place. This prophecy was dealing with the destruction of with God's judgment and destruction of Babylon. It wasn't that the world would come to an end. It was that Babylon itself would come to an end. The authority of Babylon would come to an end. Its kings would fall, its princes would fall, its armies would fall. Isaiah 34, verse 4. The heavens will fall away, the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. Does that sound familiar? This was about the destruction of Edom, not the end of the world. But to them, it was the end of the world. What about Egypt? Egypt's fall. Same language. Isaiah 51, same language. And Revelation 6 is full of it. It's full of decreation language. You see mentions of an earthquake, the sun being blotted out, becoming black, the moon turning to blood, the stars falling to earth. Chapter 8 will declare that a large fiery mountain is cast into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. Decreation language. If you were to talk to someone who views this from a dispensationalist viewpoint, they will tell you that these are literal events that will take place, like in the Left Behind series or similar. But John is using a language that the audience was familiar with. We have such a hard time understanding the language, and it has so messed up our way of interpreting the Scripture. We've got to dig and we've got to study things like this to get a better understanding so we are not deceived by false teaching. The sky being rolled up is not talking about the end of the United States or the end of everything as we know it. It's describing the nation of Edom being brought down, God's judgment coming upon them. The sky being rolled up like a scroll is mentioned in Revelation 6 too. We talked about when this was written. I look at it as being written during the time of Emperor Nero. We won't spend a lot of time there. A lot of evidence points to that. There's very little evidence that actually points to it being under the reign of Domitian. And I've really studied this because I've always heard that viewpoint. I just don't see it. I don't see it. There's too much proof that shows that it was written during the reign of Nero. Verse 1 and 2 is where we got to in our last study. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. So you have 4 living creatures, right? You have 4 of these strange, interesting-looking creatures from chapter 4 in the throne room of God. Each creature is going to say, "Come." Now there's debate as to what that word in the Greek actually means. Some argue that the creature is talking to John. Come and see. You see that? Well, that's not exactly what that word means. That word is actually directed towards the riders. Come. And John watches as the first one makes his appearance. The rider is on a white horse, wearing a crown. Stephanos in the Greek. It's a victor's crown. We read Psalm 45. We read Habakkuk 3. Both of those Old Testament scriptures detail similar language to John's writer here. It was not uncommon to see God's judgment being played out in military conquest terms. A white horse represented victory, conquest. When Vespasian and Titus were given the role from Nero to conquer Judea after Cestius Gallus fails in 66 AD, do you know how they were paraded in Rome? On white horses, stallions. They wore victors' crowns, Stephanos. Now it's debated as to, is the white rider Vespasian? Is it Titus? I don't know. Maybe. Jesus? Possibly. I don't think it's anything other than those options in my personal opinion. I don't think it's an antichrist that has yet to come. that's going to be born in North Korea or Iran or whatever the thought is nowadays. And it will change over time. That idea will change. Nothing's consistent with that view. But you know what? God uses the leaders of these nations to carry out judgment. Isaiah 45, who does he use? Cyrus, king of Persia. He even calls him his anointed one. Nebuchadnezzar in Jeremiah 25, I think is where it's at. I read it this morning. I'm trying to remember. Jeremiah 25. Nebuchadnezzar, I will bring up Nebuchadnezzar. He would bring these kings to power to deliver judgment. So could it be Vespasian, Titus, or both both together? Possibly. Could be Jesus. I see that too. In Habakkuk 3 and Psalm 45, we see God riding out on horses holding what weapon? A bow. The difference, the only difference I see in this text and those letters is in those letters he's firing arrows from the bow, and this one he's not. And that's why some people say, well, it's talking about Vespasian or Titus basically only having the authority given by God. He's not allowed to fire these arrows willingly. That's just a thought. But the Greek word for crown there, Stephanos, is mentioned 7 times in Revelation. Here we go. So in the Olivet Discourse, you remember towards the end, he says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory. And oftentimes we've taken the Olivet Discourse and we say, okay, from here to here is talking about Jerusalem's fall. And then this little part right here is talking about the end for all of us. Again, language, it matters. Jeremiah 4, 13 and 14. Behold, he shall come on the clouds, and his chariots will be like a whirlwind, his horses faster than eagles. Woe to us, for we are ruined. He's talking about Babylon. And then he uses the same language, Isaiah does, to describe Egypt's downfall. And he says in Isaiah 19:1, the Lord rides in on a what? A swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt will tremble before him, and the hearts of the Egyptians will melt with fear. Like I said, there's different ideas as to who this could be, but no doubt these writers are being led by God. There's no debating that, I don't think. God used whomever he pleased to carry out judgment on any nation, even Israel. We get to the second writer. An appropriate color, the color of bloodshed, red. I heard the second living creature say, come, and then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. It sounds like civil war, doesn't it? Kill each other. The word for sword there is actually debated as to what kind of sword. Machaira is the Greek word that's used there. And really, there's not really a clear-cut definition of that. It just refers to a cutting or thrashing sword. So could it be a Roman sword? It could be a Jewish sword. It could be any kind of sword. It's also thought to be more of a shorter sword, like a dagger of some type. The writer was given the task to take peace from the earth. Notice that. Under the Roman Empire, the Romans were enduring a time called Pax Romana. What does that mean? Peace of Rome, Roman peace. Yep. Well, you know when that got disrupted? In 66 AD, that got disrupted big time. Many people would die, not only of the civil war that would ensue, but the results of it, and then the final siege and battle. Yeah, I told you that before, that the killing was so vast that when the Romans finally broke through, in a lot of the streets, they were having to step over bodies because there were so many dead in the city. And that would lead to a third rider appearing on the scene. You can see that they all have a sequence of events. Then we get the rider on the black horse, who is holding a pair of scales in his hand. And he says, I heard what sounded like a voice among the four saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages. And do not damage the oil and the wine. When you have war and you have tribulation, especially in a siege warfare, you will inevitably end up with famine. War came at great cost, and the loss of resources such as edible food and drinkable water was one of the many. The scales in the rider's hand shows us the severity of the siege, the severity of the famine. Rationing of food would have to happen in very severe cases. Is this the only place where we see this? If you've been listening, the answer is no. Whoops. Well, okay, let's go over this real quick. A denarius, that was a day's wage. For a common laborer or soldier, that's what you got paid a day, a denarius. So the amount given and the weights given, by the way, wheat was more of it was more of a food staple of the rich. Barley was more of the poor. But the amounts given that would be enough to barely feed yourself, but that's it. And you're only paying for food. You can't use that denarius for something else. You're having to use all your money to eat. If you had a family, how do you provide in a famine like this? As I told you before, the civil war that took place within the walls was so devastating that they had destroyed a lot of their food storages before Rome ever got there. And then the siege started in April. And you know when it started? Right before Passover. And so when Rome came to siege Jerusalem, you had tens of thousands of Jews who had traveled across Judea to Jerusalem for the Passover, as was common. And the Romans let them into the city. And it was a tactic used by Titus to starve the city into submission. The more mouths to feed, the quicker the fall. That is how Rome would win their wars. They were methodical. They were not stupid in the way they fought. As I said, is this the only place where we read about a famine? No, it's not. Lamentations. That's a book we read every day, right? That's a joke. Lamentations chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. But now they are blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become dry as a stick. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. Racked with hunger, they waste away from a lack of food from the field. Now, this verse is a little disturbing. With their own hands, compassionate women have cooked their own children, who have become their food when my people were destroyed. Now, granted, what would happen is more than likely the child was already dead from famine, but they would resort to cannibalism to eat whatever they could. The Romans would actually record the same situation inside Jerusalem's walls when they finally got into the main part of the lower city and upper city. The lower city being the worst. It was so bad that when they would go into the houses to slaughter the men, anyone that was left, a lot of the houses they just walked right back out of because there was no one alive. This, can anybody tell me what this is describing? Where this took place? What was the last siege of Jerusalem in 586 BC? Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. That is recording that siege. But that's not all. Ezekiel does the same thing. Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 16 through 17. Son of man, I'm about to cut off the food supply in Jerusalem. The people will eat ration food in anxiety and drink ration water in despair. For food and water will be scarce, and they will be appalled at the sight of each other and will waste away in their sins. Oops. The siege of Jerusalem. Wheat and barley. I kind of went ahead and told you some of that. Wheat and barley were staples to the ancient world and common foods. The wheat was more expensive than barley, had to be processed more. So, like I said already, with the inflation being as high as it was, and the amount you would be able to buy a day, it wasn't really a lot. Oil and wine. This is an interesting phrase that a lot of commentators have fun playing with that I've noticed. You just have to look into the history of Jerusalem. You got to look into this history. So, number one, I only found one source on that when the trees were being stripped for siege works, that Titus told his men not to uproot the olive groves. Like I said, I only found one source on that in the vineyards. Now, if that's the case, that's interesting. Do not harm the oil and the wine. Okay? Olive fields, olive oil, vineyards, grapes, wine. Okay? 2, oil and wine were used for ritual purposes of the church at that time. It was actually common, for the communion or the Lord's Supper, they would drink wine. It wasn't grape juice, it wasn't Welch's. Welch's wasn't around. And the oil that they would use, oftentimes whenever early Christians were baptized, it wasn't uncommon to pour olive oil on the head of new converts as a way of anointing new converts. So keep that in mind. Now, the most possible application is number 3, in my personal opinion, because what happened was when Rome was coming to besiege Jerusalem, Ananus ben Ananus was the high priest. He declared himself to be king of Jerusalem because Herod Agrippa II had fled. He got out of there. He sided with the Romans as soon as he could. I mean, he was already kind of on the side of the Romans to begin with, but he got out of there because he knew the Jews were not going to be able to be controlled, and he knew he'd probably die if he stayed there. John of Gischala actually would raid the temple, kill Ananus ben Ananus, and take over the temple. And when he does that, it was at that time when Eleazar would barricade himself in the inner temple. Now, once he's deceived, John takes over everything. And one of the first things he does is he takes the gold and a lot of the architecture of the temple, and he takes it to make weapons, siege works, offensive siege works. And they were melting the gold down, just totally desecrating the temple. Before the Romans ever got in and desecrated the temple themselves, the Jews were already doing it. And not only that, but he actually took the wine and the oil that was used for religious purposes in the temple and gave them to his men. I actually have a quote here. If I can find it here. Yeah, he emptied the vessels of, this is by Josephus, he emptied the vessels of sacred wine and oil and anointed themselves with it and drank. And then we come to the 4th rider. Let's finish this up. The pale horse, spotted or ashen or green in color. The pale horse makes the appearance at the back of the horse train, with the grave following close behind, or the underworld as the Greeks called it. Obviously, if you have war, you have famine, you have disease, you are going to have death. In the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, verses 9 through 10, Jesus makes it clear that during that time of tribulation, everything will be chaotic, that people will be deceived, people will be imprisoned, and people will be killed. At the end of the discourse in verses 21 and 22, he says, "For then shall the great tribulation be." The same language that Daniel uses in Daniel 12, he says that such was not since the beginning of time, nor shall ever be again. And the idea here, the idea of the underworld or the place of the dead was not exactly a fine line between heaven and hell. Now, I could open up a whole other can of worms here. I don't want to. But the Greeks and the Romans and the Jews believed in something, a temporary place. Hades is what the Greek called it for the underworld. The Hebrews called it Sheol, which is realm of the dead. Some have argued to be the grave, but it is not the Greek word for hell, which is Gehenna. That is a different word. So the thought of a Greek underworld or Hebrew Sheol would have made sense to the recipients. When you die, your soul goes somewhere. I want you to notice this as we finish the writers up. Ezekiel 14, 19 through 21. He makes a comment there that he's going to deliver judgment in 4 ways: sword, famine, plague, and wild beast. Read that in Revelation 6. Do you see that? Sword, famine, plague, wild beast. Ezekiel 14, 19 through 21. For if I will send a plague into that land and pour out my wrath on it through bloodshed, killing its people and animals, surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, they could neither save nor son nor daughter. They would save only themselves by their righteousness. Look at this. For this is what the sovereign Lord says: how much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my 4 dreadful judgments: sword and famine, wild beast, and plague. There's your 4. These are also associated with the punishment in Ezekiel 5:12, Jeremiah 16:4, Leviticus 26:22 and 23, and Jeremiah 43:11. All of them punishments on Israel. Not to anyone else, only on Israel. Some have argued that, and this would happen. I mean, sword, obviously, famine, obviously, plague, you have disease, obviously, wild beast. The Roman military would use beasts in war, primarily dogs. They would also put a lot of the Jews they would capture from Jerusalem into the arenas and stadiums throughout the Roman Empire to fight to the death with these wild animals and beasts. But you see that any time in Israel's sin of abandonment and rejection of God and accepting of idol worship, this is the result. God mentions these 4 every time. Which is why I am making the connection to Jerusalem, to the Jews. Now, the next time I'm with you, we will go into the 5th seal. We got through 4. We got 3 more to go. Chapter 4, the throne room of God. John's focus is on the throne and he who sits on it. Chapter 5, John's focus switches to the Lamb of God, who retrieves the scroll, who is found worthy enough to retrieve the scroll because no one else was found worthy enough. Chapter 6, the Lamb is breaking the seals. Judgment is coming. And it's coming in this order. Being led out by God, God will use Rome to judge Israel. He will judge them for the rejection of the Messiah, His Son, Jesus Christ. And there is a passage that we'll look at towards the end of this study of chapter 6 that's actually from the account of Luke. I would definitely encourage that you read your gospel accounts, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you will see so many more connections for what we've studied so far. But you got to read. You got to get in the Word. You got to read it. Can't just look at your Bible with it closed. That ain't gonna do you any good, I guess. I mean, unless it just flies open, turns that page for you. But at least make the effort, right? All right. Thank y'all for your attention this morning, and hope you enjoyed and got something from the class. Thank you.